Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the Professor, and this is the Moment of Truth. I kind of have to brace myself a little bit. Sports is one of those topics that a lot of black folks just don't handle very well. And before the usual suspects get started in the comments section saying, "Oh God, Professor, do you have to do your usual preamble whenever you get ready to talk about sports?" You're doggone right I do. And you know exactly why that is. We start off talking about some athlete who's off code, or a racist team owner, and before you know it, the people in the comments section are speculating about who's going to win the NBA championship this season, or who's going to make it all the way to the Super Bowl. Or did you see how many points LeBron scored? Or did you see so-and-so's slam dunk or whatever? I don't give a rip about sports. So it's easy for me to ignore that in general and condemn sports' very existence, but I know a lot of you love sports, and I don't blame you for that. There's a reality there. But at the risk of sounding religious, we as black people must avoid the snares and vices of this white supremacist system. Sports is one of them, because we don't control it. Entertainment, by the way, is another, including the white media's so-called news. Anything that puts our minds to sleep and makes us forget that we're supposed to be taking down these bastions of corrupt power, if not take them over. I say that as a way to hopefully get everyone's minds right before we dive into this morning's briefing. Now, a lot of you have asked me about this one, and a large part of me wanted to ignore it, but since I did a story about Griner this summer, it only seemed right to follow up on it. Brittney Griner spent the better part of a year as Vladimir Putin's unwilling guest, but last week the U.S. successfully negotiated her release. Now, typically whenever these prisoner swaps are done, all we hear about is the recently freed captive and how happy they are to be out and what their family thinks, etc., etc. But in this case, the coverage has been a little bit different. What we've been hearing about is that Brittney Griner's been shaking hands with the flight crew, taking her back to the U.S. and expressing her gratitude. We've seen plenty of prisoner swaps and hostages released over the decades, so I'm sure I'm not the only one who thought that this was a rather odd thing for the Biden administration to put out there. And of course the white media is lapping it up. Clearly it's being done to send everyone the signal that this negress, she's very grateful for what the government's done for her. This is basically a way of giving a side door apology for having gotten her out. Oh, look at how grateful she is. Oh, she doesn't deserve it. Sure, she doesn't. She's black. She doesn't deserve to ever be out because no black person deserves to be free. But look at how grateful she is. Understand, it was all the black people in the U.S. who were making noise on her behalf that got her released. The LGBT community has not been anywhere near as vocal as they should have been, or as you would have thought they would have been on this one. You still had people like LeBron James, however, talking about Brittney Griner all these months later, keeping her name alive. Now, Brittney Griner has made it a point to fly the flag for the LGBT community, but can you name any of these LGBT activists who are out there putting in the work and keeping up the same energy as the black community was on Brittney's behalf? I hope that Ms. Griner keeps this in mind for future reference. She herself may identify primarily as LGBT, but the LGBT community made it clear that as far as they were concerned, well, she was the wrong color to get priority treatment from them. But I'm also going to reiterate something that I said in my other video about this incident, and that is that there are some black people who simply don't believe white supremacy is global. They simply refuse to believe that the anti-black racism that we have in the U.S. somehow exists in other countries as well. Well, let me tell you something. It does. Sure, the anti-black racism in the U.S. is the harshest that you'll find anywhere on the planet, but it is all over this planet. And the second a black person decides to forget that, oh, these other anti-black racists around the world, they'll make you pay for it. Black celebrities already live in a self-imposed bubble where they tell themselves that they're different than the average black person, better, in fact. And the white powers that be will enable and encourage that delusion. White power loves a prank that takes a long time to pay off. This particular prank may have taken a few years to get the payoff, but I'm sure that those white supremacists over there in the Kremlin were busy spitting up their vodka, laughing their guts off about this one. Now, there is something else that needs to be mentioned, even if only as a side note. I think we all know it's probably not out of the realm of possibility that Brittney Griner has taken cannabis oil or whatever that stuff was to Russia with her in the past. And they didn't do anything about it before, so she probably figured that meant they knew better than to come at her. After all, she is loosely affiliated with the NBA, which does have influence, so she probably told herself, hey, they wouldn't want the bad publicity of hassling her over some minor contraband, right? Wrong. There's some black people who think that being a little higher profile than most means that these white supremacists will know better than to mess with them. And that's a delusion black people simply cannot afford. Being a higher profile black person simply makes you a higher profile target, not a lower one. Now, from the news reports, the reason the WNBA players go to Russia to play in the first place is because they get 4 to 5 times as much money in Russia as they do in the US. And I guess that's why Brittney Griner was over there, and a number of WNBA players go over there. They're definitely not doing it for the weather. When someone's giving you more money than you make at home, I guess it's easy to forget that this person probably doesn't like you. It's easy to convince yourself of things that aren't true either. Like, for instance, you might start telling yourself that your hosts in such and such a country, they know that you bring a little bit of pot with you, and, well, they're understanding of that kind of thing because they like you, right? Because after all, the racism's not so bad over there in Moscow as it is, say, in Minneapolis, right? And in Brittney's case, like a lot of black people, we often fall under the illusion that these other countries, they won't take a black person hostage. After all, we're black, we don't have any power or money, so who wants a hostage with no real value, right? And that might be the case if you're talking about a black person in isolation or just your regular black tourist. But in the case of Brittney Griner, she isn't rich, but she does have a high profile, and she comes from a group of people in the US who will make noise on her behalf. And although Brittney Griner may not be the most famous basketball player, she is loosely affiliated with a bunch of the biggest basketball players on the planet who would never hear the end of it if they didn't speak up on her behalf. So it wasn't hard for Putin and his pals to figure out what angle they could play with this one. And I know that a lot of you like to travel, and that's fine. I'm not telling you don't. What I am telling you is, please do not go telling yourself that just because some person over there, wherever there may be, makes nice with you when they're standing in front of you, that somehow that means you're friends. As long as it suits their purposes, they may well let you get by with some minor stuff. That is, until they don't. Griner was in Russia to play basketball and nothing else. She also decided to bring cannabis oil with her, and I'm sure she saw it. She's benefiting Russia's economy and culture. And she's the highest profile WNBA player, so why would the Russians want to do something that would alienate and discourage other WNBA players from going there? But as Putin saw it, she was just a bargaining chip, the highest profile American that he could trump up some charges on. And after all, the reason Griner was in Russia was because she couldn't make the kind of money in the US that she was making there. That hasn't changed, by the way. Not for Brittney Griner, not for the rest of the WNBA. So unless the girls decide that they want to switch careers, it is what it is. Russia's the only place that pays them halfway decent. And you better believe they'll eventually rationalize it by saying that, well, the Russians only nabbed her because she had contraband, but none of the rest of them had any real problems, and as long as they keep their noses clean, the Ruskies will leave them be, etc. And they may well be right. But there's no guarantee of it. Some black people are so desperate to escape white supremacy, they refuse to accept that although the harshest and most vicious form of anti-black racism is in the US doesn't have a monopoly on anti-black racism. White supremacy is a disease that has infected the whole world. Leaving the US also means leaving the place where people actually fought for what few rights a black person might enjoy. And worse than that, leaving the US also means you're separated from the very numbers of black people that you would need to speak up on your behalf for a circumstance like this. Some black folks go to these foreign countries and they think that because the racism is a little less severe there, they just become so relieved because to them, they're like, oh man, it's like there's no racism here at all. Because you don't have the heavy-handed, omnipresent racism of the US, a lot of black people convince themselves that there's no racism in these other places, or at least it's very minor, and they're wrong. The main reason that they believe this is because most black tourists, and even black business travelers, can't speak the language of the places they visit. And most of them usually stay in the tourist traps. So you better believe that whatever the country's local board of tourism is, they make sure to clean it up. They don't have the real heavy anti-black stuff around there. So when you combine that with the fact that most black folks do not know the language of the people who they're around in these countries, black folks have no idea what these foreigners are saying about them. Keep in mind, when that cab driver that picked you up at the airport or that souvenir shop owner who was making nice with you, when they get to the United States, all of a sudden they start acting like any other anti-black racist that you've ever met. Doesn't matter if they're from Japan, Russia, Mexico, or wherever. When they get here, they immediately begin acting towards black folks the same way as any other anti-black racist. Something a lot of these traveling black people just don't want to have to admit is that these folks that they were meeting overseas, they didn't become racist when they got to the U.S. The U.S. itself was not what made them racist. That's one of the misconceptions a lot of black people want to hold on to. In most cases, when you look at the cultures of these countries, you see that they've practiced a culture of anti-black racism the entire time. Now, when your only contact with these people is at the souvenir shop, or a taxi driver, or with some tourist guide who's walking you and the rest of your tour group around the downtown area, or some boat trip that you paid for, you can start to think that how they act towards you when you're paying them is how they regarded you the whole time. We try to tell ourselves that, oh, this is friendship, we were friends, when in fact it was just business. Nothing more. Be it in the U.S. or abroad, folks always like to act like they love black people until we say something they don't like, or until they see a chance to use us as pawns in the game. What happened to Brittney Griner has happened to a number of black people, though in many cases we don't hear about what happened to these black victims at all. This is not paranoia that I'm trying to instill you with. It's about being on your P's and Q's and understanding the reality of the world that we live in. Pedro and Dimitri, they didn't become racist when they got to the U.S. They were already racist back in the old country when you met them at the souvenir shop or met them as a tourist guide or whatever. It's hard enough for black people to visit these foreign countries as is without putting ourselves in a trick bag, which is what Brittney did. But understand the bag was when you stepped off the plane. So let this be a reminder. We have no friends. Not in the U.S., not anywhere. Brittney Griner just learned a harsh lesson. Maybe. She lost 10 months of her life in the middle of a Russian hellhole, and for what? She went over to Russia just to play some ball, and she found out the hard way that anti-black racism is no game. Good day, and be one.